Hey Bible lovers, I'm Tim Nicholas, and I'm here to bring you your Nichols Worth. And last week I was on Tim Frisch's YouTube channel, and we talked about updates to the New King James and the value of updates. And of course, as you know, things got a little feisty because I am always the energy and the feistiness. And Tim Frisch began to talk about how the King James was obsolete. We disagreed on what that term meant, and we went back and forth. And here's kind of the end result. Check out this video.
The King James Version has not been updated significantly for hundreds of years.
Since 1769, unless you count the
Right.
pure Cambridge edition,
Right.
which
Right.
was tweaked with pronoun capitalizations and stuff like that in the early 1900s.
Why don't you use the King James Version?
Why don't I use the King James Version? Because I can read it without any issue. Like, I can read the King James Version without any issue. It's when I speak it that I struggle with it a bit. Where the New King James works better conversationally.
Yeah. And I think, am I correct in saying, Tim, you were saying if the New King James wasn't available, the translation you would use is the King James?
I would use the King James.
Perfect.
If there was no New King James. And the reason is because I prefer the Textus Receptus.
Mm-hmm.
I prefer that manuscript group.
But why wouldn't you use the modern English version?
Well, I'm reading through the modern English version, so ask me in 60 days. Perhaps I would.
So again, it boils down to it's easier to pronounce.
It boils down to it's easier to use in conversation, which I am standing up in front of a congregation for 45 minutes preaching the word. I don't want to be reading in a language that is difficult for me.
Just for you or for your people?
Perhaps we have a preacher that preaches out of the King James, but he's Nigerian and he has that flowy English style. No one has trouble understanding him outside of his Nigerian accent.
Yeah.
But it's just something I don't know that it'd be difficult for my audience to understand. It's difficult for me to speak it. As a matter of fact, I've used the King James several times and I just fix it as I'm reading it to where it's more conversational for me.
Yeah.
So it's a beautiful
the point though, that even if you boil it down, and I can tell you're doing a good job with this, you're not making any kind of issue of language as much as you can, but still using the term conversational as code for it's not as easy to use in our current. It's obsolete.
Well, I mean, I'll go ahead and say it. It uses archaic words. It uses
it's obsolete
English. You can still use it. It's still actually a usable translation. I can preach from the King James. I would just have to fight my way through words. So we're talking 200 plus years since this thing's been updated. Yeah. And I could still effectively preach from it if I can just get over I could get used to it. But I don't.
When did it become obsolete, you think?
I never said the King James is obsolete. I do not believe the King James is an obsolete translation. I believe it is a very.
You're not using it.
I'm not using it because it works better for me, according to the language that I've used my entire life.
That's what I mean by obsolete. If you're choosing something that's newer over it, then you're basically saying I need the newer over the older.
So it's obsolete for me. You're saying perhaps, but I wouldn't consider it an obsolete translation.
I'm just going based on your use.
Oh, I get the point.
Yeah.
And
so if you never update, you will become obsolete.
Overall, like for everyone?
No, I'm just saying that's the way the flow of translations work. The American Standard Version, it's another one that it's obsolete.
Well, that's a terrible translation. That's another conversation for another day.
People eventually stop using translations. I'll show you. Let me see if I can bring it up here. So I'll tell you, the one thing in your favor, look at the King James, April 2025. It just shows you the staying power of the King James.
Mm-hmm.
It really does. What I would say, though...
Sorry, I was just going to say, one of the things I was just checking there is, this is in the US, so this is not counting anywhere else in the world, but 20 million Bibles are sold each year, of which the KJV accounts for 31% of those Bible purchases.
Yep.
Yeah, so it's not an obsolete translation.
No.
I wouldn't consider it obsolete for me because I use it in a reading context. I just don't use it in a preaching conversational context.
Let me push back on this a little bit.
Go ahead.
Obsolete does not mean it's not used. What it means is it is falling out of its former usage. That's all I mean by that. So the King James should be, based on its heritage and based on its beauty, it should be the translation that is number one. But because of the language, it is now at least number three on a pretty regular basis, I believe. At least in these sales. I understand it actually does pretty well if you go based on other statistics. So all I'm saying is for the emerging generations, it becomes more and more out of date. That's all I mean by obsolete. I know people don't like that term because it's harsh, but I'm just being honest about what happens. That translations do fall out of usage eventually.
200
Even the
years.
King James. Well, the King James that's kind of what I'm trying to say is the King James was such a main translation for English speaking people. The fact that has fallen out of usage is incredible. The top two are the ones that are updating.
From a sales standpoint, I mean, there's no arguing that updating will merit more sales, which takes us back to that argument that their motive is to make money. And I don't know that it is, but I also think we can't overlook the fact that the King James is number 3 in sales without an update since 1769. And as Nicholas said, it composes 30% of sales in the world.
But look at the trajectory.
Yeah, but we're talking 200 and some years later.
I mean, but the trajectory has exponentially, I would argue, it's decreased from 1600 to 1900 was very minimal. Its decrease from 1900 to 2000 was significant, and it's
had no competition. It had no competition from 1600s.
Well, it did. It did, but that's the point. Is that up until the mid 1900s, that competition didn't matter because the King James English was still relatively understandable. It's become obsolete.
And see, I'm just not there because I can, like I said, I can read it, and I have a moderate education. I don't have a seminary degree. I don't have an understanding of the.
I'm really.
Well, and the thing is, that's what we do, Tim. We argue over big matters like this, and
yes,
but we're friends. And I guess I just don't understand the point that the King James or the New King James will become irrelevant at any time before 2184. How many years do you update a translation over and over again before you just give up and do a new translation?
Yeah. I agree. It won't become irrelevant. Marginalized might be the better term, because the New King James and the King James during the 80s and 90s were probably in a statistically, like as far as percentage of churches, there was probably a pretty high percentage. What I'm saying is that percentage will probably at some point reach a lower level. It may stay there. It may stay at that level, but it's going to be a vast minority of churches is my prediction.
Yeah, well, and I think, see, the difference between the King James and the New King James is the King James, it had like the Great Bible, the Geneva Bible, Matthew's Bible, and the Douay Rheims, which was kind of around the same-ish time when you consider the Old Testament and the New Testament being around 1610. Its competition was pretty minimal when it first started. And actually, the King James wasn't very well received at first when it was first put out. It took a while for it to become the translation of the English-speaking world. But then you come in with the New King James, and we had the RSV. We had the ASV, we had the KJV, and then we had the NIV coming around at the same time. And then this explosion of translations that has occurred. Even the NASB was around in 1977. So it came in this sea of competition. And not only that, new translations that have emerged since, the ESV, the NLT, you name it. And the fact that it's coming in at number 5, I think I'm winning, Tim. I think I'm winning today.
Well, yeah, I mean, the only problem with all of the things you're saying, like even what you just said, is why did all those translations all of a sudden become competition? because
they came at the same time, same language, and older and better manuscripts.
yeah, but remember that started in the late 1800s.
1881 with the
right.
English Revised Version.
Right.
Hort.
So the mid 1900s, the culture had gotten to a point, whether we like it or not, where the King James was no longer meeting the needs, at least from people's perception. It was no longer meeting the needs the way it had in the past. That's why those translations were becoming so popular. So yeah, the King James has become, in its widespread regular usage among many churches, it has become increasingly obsolete. The King James has. And that's what happens if you never update. So I think my point stands, at least on that particular
point. We're talking 200 plus years.
But I just keep saying you should consider at what point does something become obsolete.
Here's the thing. How many people would still appreciate the NIV 1984 if it were still available? If it were replaced by the 2011? I know I would be in that camp. In fact, I might even use it. The problem is when you update a translation and it truly makes obsolete the translation that you once had for 20, 25 years, and there's no longer an NKJV 1984. Now there's the NKJV 2034.
But the NAS 77 truly exemplifies that type of language is obsolete, because how many people use the 77? It's not even the language isn't as old as the King James, and yet even the 77 is not very usable.
But I think that updates create that perception as well. Because why am I going to read the 77 when I've got the 95? Why am I going to read the 95 when I've got the 2020?
If you're 50, right around there, and you have an understanding of words, and then a new understanding of words comes along, you don't forget the old understanding. You still remember the old. Mm-hmm. But the younger people, they're the ones who don't always pick up on the older meaning of words. So it's very hard to tell when language is changing. I'll give you an example in the New King James. Awesome. They use the word awesome. The LSB chose to not use that word. But when you say awesome now, it doesn't carry that weight that it ought to. Just a subtle thing that changes over time.
And I think there's a growing, we spoke about this a couple of weeks ago on the podcast as well. There is a growing trend, especially young men, of desiring stuff that is more traditional. And especially on X, I'm seeing an awful lot of young men actually switching to the New King James because they want a text that is stable, but they don't want to go as far back to the King James, because in all reality, they do struggle. And I'm not saying you can't learn to read the King James. You can. Like, I think most everybody on X knows I only read the Psalms in the King James. I just prefer them. I prefer how they sound. I even prefer to pray them from the King James. But going back to my point, I do see a lot of young men, and probably women too, but it's mainly men I'm working with. And they really are desiring to have a stable text. And I think if there ever is an update of the King James, I think most people probably would prefer that it is just the footnotes.
So there you have it. Clearly, Tim and I have a difference of opinion on what obsolete means, and we also have a difference of opinion on whether or not the New King James should be updated and if the King James itself is outdated. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the King James is obsolete? Do you think it should no longer be used publicly? Or do you think it is no longer as useful as it used to be? Do you think the fact that it's fallen off a little bit in sales is a big problem, showing that the days of the King James is over? Or do you feel it's still a translation that should be heavily used and relied on? Do you think it's a translation that is not obsolete but is extremely useful? Let me know in the comments. God bless you. Keep calm. Jesus on. This is your Nicholsworth.